You're listening to Mental Health Unmuted, Grabbing the Aux. Mental Health Unmuted is a growing community of young adult and youth leaders in Illinois with an interest in mental health. And this is the podcast, brought to you by NAMI Illinois, the National Alliance of Mental Illness Illinois State Organization. This podcast features conversations with the Mental Health Unmuted work group, with guests and spotlights on topics that matter to us. This work group focuses on creating and applying innovative strategies that involve three pillars: anti stigma, advocacy, and building a community of support, providing the voice to emphasize the youth and young adult perspective. Disclaimer: we are not psychiatrists, clinicians, and we are not social workers, but we are experts in our own experience with mental health and wellness. We call this living experience. Our expertise are developed from our experiences as individuals, as young people, and our passions. Everyone has mental health. You are not alone, and more than enough. It's time to act and talk about it. Let's do this. Hey, yay! Welcome to Recorded over a virtual platform. I am Mental Health Unmuted Director Techly D, and co-hosting today we are joined by Jack from NAMI Kane County North and Mental Health Unmuted members. Jack Warner serves as a member of the NAMI Kane County North affiliate and has kept the principles of advocacy and support near to his heart, as mental illness has touched his family. Anna Termolin. Anna is a recent Dartmouth College graduate who has returned home to Chicago to work in research. Annie Camps is a master graduate from Illinois State University and a local title holder within the Miss America organization, where she works to help others survive their own adversities. Maricruz Herrera is a recovery support specialist and mental health professional for NAMI Metro Suburban. They were diagnosed with a mood disorder due to a pituitary adenoma, ADHD, and PTSD. And Ariel Jones, previously a data intern with NAMI DuPage. Ariel now continues to work in public health and mental health advocacy in their county and state. Today we're talking about stigma. What is stigma? How does it affect us? And how can we be stigma busters?
So, stigma is one of the pillars we've been working closely with as a work group. This whole episode is going to focus around stigma. But I think before we jump into our conversation surrounding stigma, it's important to define the word first. There's a definition that was found in a Healthline article in October of last year, and it cites the sociologist Irving Goffman, who repurposed the term in the early 1960s and gave stigma its modern definition. In a nutshell, Goffman basically states that stigma refers to any negative attitude, prejudice, or false belief associated with specific traits, circumstances, or health symptoms. Discrimination, which is a related but distinct concept, describes how someone treats you because of this stigma. And as a work group, we have been working with this definition as well. But I'm open it up to any of the panelists that wish to add or amend certain parts of that definition as they wish to do so.
Well, listening to Jack say this again, I wanted to open up an idea for everyone. If every single stigma is in fact a negative attitude or prejudice, because I have been looking into stigma when preparing to talk about this, and some of them are stigmas related towards positive subjects or meanings. And I have never thought of that before, and I personally don't know how I feel about that, seeing as my definition has always included stigma to be around something negative.
I mean, I think it makes perfect sense for stigma to encompass positive seeming things because I feel like a lot of the time, especially if you have a disability or if, there are certain traits that people think are good because it's like a positive stereotype. I guess part of that stigma to me would also mean like people say something positive and they expect something of you that's like superhuman. You can't do it. I mean, it's like if you don't meet that, then that eventually becomes negative.
I totally hear where you're coming from. I generally think of that more as stereotypes, and stigma more as like a negative connotation associated with something, but that's just the way I've always thought about it.
Yeah, I agree with everyone. So I very much relate to what Annie was saying on my perception of stigma has for many years has been understanding of it being a negative way. I know there's 4 different structures of stigma. We have self-stigma, social public stigma, structural stigma, and then there's other forms of stigma that can include perceived stigma, stereotype stigma that was associated, stigma that even health practitioners may have, other labels that make them be avoidant. So I think stigma has, my understanding of stigma is a view of it as a negative way, besides just the stereotypes. Because I think that yes, there's stereotypes, and they're mainly rooted from those that stigma that is perceived either by within mental health, within a race, within ethnicity, within other forms of identity, and its intersectionality of it.
Those are all really interesting points. So the definition that we had come up with as a group, which I would like to know everyone's opinion if it kind of has shifted a little bit, but the definition we came up with, which is very similar, is that stigma is a negative misconception, implicit and explicit, towards cultures and adverse communities and individuals. So I kind of want to get anyone's take on if that definition still stands or if we'd like to add or amend to it. Again, that's the definition we came up with as a work group earlier this year.
I think it would be also awesome to add maybe stigma can come from an internal place when we confuse bad feelings with being bad.
I believe this change is very beneficial to our stigma conversation. Typically, when someone with a mental illness or mental health symptom is called dangerous or crazy, that's what we refer to as stigma. But when you mention positive stigma, some of those examples can be like too smart, too much, too annoying. And so it's interesting that we, over the course of this conversation, we've kind of shifted it from stigma is negative to having an understanding that stigma is harmful. It's a harmful misconception that is both internal and external, implicit and explicit towards cultures and adverse communities.
I definitely want to second that. Absolutely. I think that Annie, going back to what you said about bringing up that there are positive components about stigma. And I think that, like me personally, like going along with what everybody said, is that we've kind of always just gave stigma this negative connotation, but I think harmful is definitely the adjective we want to use here. And I definitely agree with all of you on that. So taking this definition that we've established as a work group, that stigma is a harmful misconception, I'd like to propose the question of, in what ways does stigma affect us as young adults? In Illinois recently, there's been a lot of progressive legislation regarding mental illness, but before, back in 2020, I was reading this article about how just the massive mental health funding cuts in Illinois, combined with the state's budget impasse, left fewer facilities available, facilities to provide treatment and support to those in need.
Well, 1 in 5 US adults experience mental illness every year, and 1 in 6 US youth, 6 to 17 years old, experience a mental health disorder every year.
I also read recently that a lifetime mental illness begins by the age of 14, which is extremely young when we think about it. And I know that the topic of mental health and mental illness is relatively new to be having in a casual type of atmosphere. 50% of mental illness begins by 14, and we're not even having those conversations until at least I was 20 is very shocking as well. 75% of lifetime mental illness is by the age of 24. So again, with this being a youth and young adult podcast focusing on that, it's amazing that we're having these conversations and opening this up so that people who are affected by mental illness while they are young have the resources and groups to be able to explore that, because I know that's something that I would have benefited from, and I'm sure we'll all chat about the same types of things later in the podcast.
Yeah, I definitely think that these statistics that you all just listed off give reason to why we have to destigmatize mental illness. I mean, like Annie said, yeah, by age 14, I mean, that is incredibly young. And me personally, I know that I really wasn't having conversations about mental health in like friend groups or even with, I guess, like teachers and guardians and things like that until I was in my college years. So, yeah, those statistics definitely are a telltale that stigma is so prevalent. And, we do have to destigmatize in order to reach out to those young people at age 14 and even younger, based off what those statistics said. Absolutely.
Let's talk about how stigma has affected us as young people. One of our mental health unmuted pillars is stigma, which is why we're talking about it today. And one of the best ways to break that barrier is to talk openly about mental health. I'm going to open up the floor to our panelists who are doing a wonderful job this evening on talking about their experiences.
When I started to have an understanding of stigma, I think was very interesting. I was probably like 13 years old. I grew up in Little Village in Chicago, and none of the clinics that I had ever gone to ever explained to my mother what ADHD was or that I was diagnosed at a young age. I remember it was until I was probably 13 that there's a new clinic in the community. This was like a community clinic where that had a lot of resources and technology to help this underrepresented, underfunded community to have access to behavioral health. And my mom was talking to my primary doctor, and my primary doctor was trying to explain to her what ADHD was, and my mom just was not understanding. And she's like, no, it's not that. That's not that. The doctors always said that that she was gonna grow out of it when she was younger, and I could see, I could see that this doctor was becoming frustrated at my mother because she was trying to explain to her. And my mother's someone that I very much adore, and she's someone who grew up in a small village in Mexico, so her knowledge of mental health was absolutely non-existing. So I remember the doctor was like, okay, I'm gonna send you to this social worker, and she's going to see your daughter for therapy. I immediately remember my mom to say, don't tell this to anybody, don't tell your teachers that you're going to therapy. They're going to think this and that. And I started to really internalize it and think that it was something very negative. And I began to feel this negative or this very harmful feeling because I was hiding myself until then. I went to college, and my teacher was like, "Hey, how about you go to the accommodation center and go talk to one of the workers there, and maybe they can help you." And this was a school that was my first time ever going to a place where there were 15 students in a classroom. Usually it was like 40 students in the class. And it was a very interesting experience to see that process of how much I wanted to hide in this bubble that made me feel like I really, really bad about myself. And it was very, very harmful to my mental health in general and my self-esteem. But I think that was a little bit of my experience with stigma and my personal experience.
Thank you, Mari Cruz. That was wonderful. If you don't mind if I go next. I actually was thinking about this, and my first time that I kind of understood stigma was when it came to my family and us living in poverty and my parents' addictions. And I never realized until much later that it really was mental illness that my mother and I have talked in depth about now. And we really realized what it was. But before, I thought it was a stigma and negative attitudes towards other things. And I never realized that mental illness and mental health was really at the core, and that my family was struggling with things and I felt ashamed because of it. Not even, beginning to explore my own mental health journey and maybe some of the things that I were doing or my life was affecting me in a way that maybe I wasn't really examining. But specifically with my mental health journey, I remember I was riding in the back of my car back to my apartment with my then my mom, and I was reading a young adult magazine, and there was a test. There were a couple tests on mental illness, and just take these tests and like see if you fit in here. And I remember thinking, wow, it's so odd that this is in here, but like, kudos for them for being so forward. And I took half of the tests and none of them matched up. And I was like, okay, wonderful. And I looked at borderline personality disorder, and every single thing on the little list in this little magazine in the back of the car fit perfectly with my life experiences and fit perfectly with what my mom was going through as well. I just started crying in the back of the car, and I remember looking over to my boyfriend at the time and saying, "Oh my gosh, this is what happened." And it was kind of put up by a wall. And I remember crying and being so upset and being like, this is such a big deal. I can't understand why no one else thinks this is such a big deal. And so that was a really big part of me and my mental health journey, and realizing that, I have this, but I don't want to talk about it because I tried to bring it up and was shot down, and was repeatedly told, no, you don't have that. You would have had it before. You would have had symptoms, blah, blah, blah. And so that definitely was something hard. And I realized that the more that I talked about it and the more that I got in groups to help people and shared about that and started sharing with my mom, that's when the stigma that I felt and the negative stereotyping that people would put around me and my family kind of started to melt away. So it's definitely shifted for me throughout my life, but it's something that I've worked really hard along with all of you to not let control me or my future.
Thank you so much, Annie and Mari Cruz. My personal experience with stigma was, I guess, was tested when I definitely had to be an advocate for another family member. My mom's brother, so my uncle, was diagnosed with schizophrenia at a very young age, in his early 20s. And schizophrenia is, when people found out that I had a relative that had schizophrenia, I'm sure you could imagine the type of responses they had, just because, schizophrenia is a mental illness that people think is so debilitating and has, like I said, just been so villainized. And my mom being the advocate for my uncle, she was his power of attorney and everything. And I just witness firsthand the process she had to go through, with getting him proper care and housing, and just even the stigma she faced in bureaucracy and in healthcare. So definitely saw the stigma that surrounded that illness, along with mental illness in general. But I think that I've definitely seen it evolve, like the stigma around mental illness and schizophrenia specifically, and just how as time has gone on today, my uncle has been able to get more access to housing and to things like that. And I think that does have a lot to do with the stigma has melted around that illness. So, and then also just, seeing my mom have to be the advocate and having to fight that stigma head on was, I think, really, like, for me, was what taught me a lot about stigma, and taught me about how it is a very harmful misconception to make, and it is a very harmful quality to portray to people with mental illnesses. So shifting from how stigma has affected us personally, I think it's great to talk about how we have personally seen the stigma around mental health change. I think it definitely goes without saying that the conversation around mental health has evolved for the better. We are certainly talking about mental illness in all types of groups, whether it be social groups with our friends and family, or even in political groups in terms of passing legislation regarding mental health. The conversation has definitely changed for the better. But I'd like to open up the floor to talk specifically of how we have personally seen the stigma around mental health.
Personally, I was very shocked when I got into a college setting, and like was said before, one of my teachers mentioned the free counseling and therapy services that we had as students, and it was such a casual conversation. So I remember that I immediately thought like, okay, wow, let me go walk through there. And it definitely was still a little bit weird for me. And I felt a little bit, internal shame that I had to work through myself. But that was one of the first times where I realized, okay, college is a place where you actually talk about those types of things, but then you also take it seriously and go speak to professionals. So it's not just you chatting with your friends about how hard it is. Everyone supports you when you're going to speak with the people at the school that are there to speak with you. And so I thought that was really amazing. And it definitely helped me journey into therapy and get at least semi comfortable talking to someone about my experiences that I had in my childhood.
I definitely agree with a lot of the things you said because I really didn't have a lot of conversations about mental health until I absolutely had to, sort of as bad as that sounds. Because, when my mental health symptoms got to a point where I literally couldn't function at school for like years at a time, that was when that conversation was had. But then, I go to college and I struggled a lot with the whole, disability accommodations process for, like for college. And then I had this professor who I was talking to about this, and we were both wearing glasses. This is kind of a funny thing. He's looking at me and he says, "Well, you and I are both wearing glasses. Like, makes sense for you to do something else that's going to help you, like that you really need." And I mean, I feel like that shift also kind of happened with all of my friends, like in my friend group from high school going to college, because in high school, it was definitely something that we really didn't talk about, like going to therapy or having those conversations. And I feel like most of my friends did make that transition into college too, because they were mostly met with very supportive environments where, we all now like encourage each other to grow and do things that we need to do to improve as people. But it does make it a lot harder, I think, to, say you've gotten to this point where you can talk about mental health stuff on a daily basis and you can advocate for yourself and things like that. It becomes really hard to be in spaces where people can't. And I think that's like the biggest problem that I think people have going forward is then, how do you fix that divide between the people who are getting more and more comfortable with mental health and improving themselves and people who aren't ready to do that yet?
Thanks, Ariel. I want to support that. In my experience, stigma was around more physical health than it was mental health because I grew up in a very open environment. So I could talk about, what was affecting me, how I felt, things like that. But I understand that not many people get that experience, that environment where they feel safe enough to say what's going on with them, to be able to ask for that help. And I feel in society, the adults, the people who are in this older generation, are so used to bottling up inside. Like you hear about all these stories about them not being able to talk about their family situation or not being able to do something that is related to mental health because it wasn't a priority. And we're slowly seeing this shift. Like I'm seeing it online on social media, I'm seeing it in communities and in conversations, I'm seeing it at the legislative level, I'm seeing it in the educational level. But I'm also, as I've been growing up, seeing more of how mental health has affected and influenced the environment that a lot of us, I think, now refer to as like a work-life balance. Like it's not just affecting us in our home life. It's like burnout at work. It's this having to study an academic performance and these other oddities of life. And the stigma of mental health is still there. You can find out more about the National Alliance on Mental Illness and NAMI Illinois by visiting namiillinois.org. That's www.namiillinois.org. Thank you for listening to Mental Health Unmuted Grabbing the Ox, a NAMI Illinois podcast. Direction and production for this episode was done by Techly Kuntz. Editing this episode was Annie Camps and Ariel Hernandez Lyons. Special thank you to our panelists and the National Alliance on Mental Illness Illinois State Affiliate for their support to emphasize youth and young adult voices.
If you or someone you know is in a crisis, call or text the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988 in the United States. For imminent danger, call 911 and request a crisis intervention trained officer.